I had originally decided to do a short about the beret. It's one of my favorite hats. I was going to fill the whole thing with facts and a list of all the famous people who wore them and give you even a little bit of Latin. But it occurred to me that there's a different story here. And as I dug in, I found a more interesting and compelling conversation about culture. The beret, its very simple form, started showing up, documented around 3200 BCE. And it was known to be worn by the Etruscans and the Minoans and the ancient Cretians. It also shows up in cultures in Afghanistan and in other places as sort of versions of what you can see what used to be a beret. Beret is a really simple shape. It's a donut and a disc. If you make it with flat woven fabric or leather, it's absolutely something easy to make. If you knit it, or before knitting there was nail binding and you did that, you just keep making a circle until it's the size you want it to be, and then you decrease that until it's the size that fits your head. And if you don't quite get it right, you can put in a drawstring and make it fit. It's a really, really simple hat. There's no brims, there's no wire structure, there's no really specialized material to make it other than either your knitting or nail binding or your sewing tools and some cutting tools. So as a hat shape, even though it only shows up in the Northern Europe and in parts of the Mediterranean as documented, I argue as a milliner that it's something that all cultures that make hats would have gone through with whatever material they have available. At some point, the idea of making a disc and a donut in some way that then sits on your head would have happened. Whether it's really, really big or really small to the head, it would have happened because it's so straightforward and it's difficult to see. I know archaeologists and anthropologists don't like this, but I propose that the beret as a structure, as a design, would have been explored in nearly every culture that makes some kind of hat. Because not all cultures made hats. They didn't need to. But in all cultures that made hats for protection and warmth, I think the beret is something that, as we see it as a shape, is something that happened. Now, the beret that we know now came from the Basque region of Spain. It's a felted wool. This is one of my ones here. The little stem is called le cabayou, which is French. It got associated very quickly with French rural and working class and Spanish and rural working class. It's still used today as an iconic sort of symbol of the French culture. It had really been, by the 1920s, it had really solidified into the idea that it is the French rural working class, especially the shape we see now, which is a Basque style. The one I'm wearing is a sewn one where it has a seam here, and it's the donut and the disc. And it's such a versatile shape, but it's very, very serviceable. Felted wool is waterproof, it's breathable, it's relatively easy to clean, it's relatively easy to make. So this is something that you want to have as a really serviceable hat. Now, we associate, meaning the Northern European UK culture, we associate the beret with artists, and oftentimes a 17th century painter Rembrandt gets associated with this idea because he decided to paint himself repeatedly in a beret, which the peasants have been wearing for many, many centuries. You see the Tudor, it shows up in Tudor times. It's very, very much a peasant hat, but the Tudor nobility would wear a beret version, and they called it a bonnet. The beret shape is there, but it can't ever be what the peasants wore. It's just a version of what the peasants wore. And so this is a shape that repeats again and again. We have it showing up on the nobility and the Tudors, and then we have it showing up on paintings that Rembrandt did in the 17th century. And he, for some reason, at some point, which I think is a 20th century, late 19th century idea, that artists and berets are connected. But if we look at who was wearing, which artists were wearing the berets at which time, we see a slightly different story. What we see in the late 19th century and the early 20th century are artists who are interested in the working class, in the peasant class, in the everyman, in the story that isn't the rich, that isn't the nobility. This time in art is one of the new times that we are able to have artists making art that isn't just commissioned by rich people to decorate their homes or to glorify their wars. They are able to create pieces of artwork because the entire art society had changed. I'm not going to go into a big deep dive about that, but in the early 20th century, we see people like Pablo Picasso, and in fact, he wore them throughout his life, although being Spanish, that's not surprising. And then we see people like Marcel Duchamp wearing berets, and there's many, many other people, and they're often people who were living in spaces with people who wore them as their everyday hat, because this is, I mean, everybody now wears a baseball hat in North America. I'm in Canada. So everybody, you see baseball hats are ubiquitous. Well, there was a time where berets in France and in Spain were ubiquitous. And so they were on everybody, and they were on the working class. And is it because these artists wanted to associate themselves with the working class? Because they weren't, or they were originally, or they wanted to blend in? Were they virtue signaling? I'm not really sure. But I think the association has come in a way that's not the story that historians have told. I think it started and people held on to it. I think it started, they put it back to Rembrandt, and artists wear berets, and they held on to it. But it 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 it's a weak argument. And I think it's a complex story about why we associate artists with berets, and it still happens. It still really happens. We see a lot of jazz musicians wearing berets. We have Dizzy Gillespie, and then later on Thelonious Monk. We also have a lot of military and police around the world wear berets. It's so common in military and police wear as part of their uniform. And it is absolutely a fashion thing. In the 1920s, the flappers, so the mid to the end of the 1920s, the flappers just held on to that beret, and they loved it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. And it was a new hat. And again, this is the 20s. And again, this beret was the one we're talking about here, this felted wool. Although the shape has been in fashion either as a big paneled thing or small thing, off and on for ages and ages. Every time I do one of my blog series for the history of hats for every decade, there is a discussion about a tam or a beret shape every time. It doesn't go away. And I don't think that's going to stop. What I see, though, is that in the 20th century, the beret stays, the Basque beret, and I'm calling it that because it's the felted one with the little stem, the one that you can buy still, the one you can see all over the streets of Paris when you go to the tourist areas. And in fact, I'm guilty of buying one because I was there and it was cold and I didn't have a hat, and so I bought one, and they are inexpensive and warm. I think part of the story of the beret is also that it has become a symbol of resistance. You see it all the way from back in the 1700s in Scots wearing it during particular resistance fighting, but you definitely in the 20th century see the Basque beret with the little cabout in the French resistance during the Second World War, right on through to the Black Panthers in the 60s, and even the Green Berets in the 80s. It is something that is just as ubiquitous as the beret is in culture, that it's a symbol of resistance. So we have artists, we have musicians, we have fashion models, we have famous actors, we have the everyday man wearing them, we have the working class wearing them, we have farmers wearing them, we have the military wearing them, we have the police wearing them. So I think the story of the beret is not so much about this show on Netflix brought the hat back. Ooh, and this person wore it on stage, and then they brought the beret back. And Madonna wore it in a video in the 80s. And she started the whole, I don't think it's that. I think it's a shape that we love as a people. And I think if I got the opportunity to dive further into other cultures other than the Northern Europe culture, which I was looking at, I would see that kind of repeating of we love this shape and it keeps coming back. So the beret is a hat for everyone. And I think that's the story of the beret. If you want to learn more about the history of hats, you can head on over to my website and check out my blog with an ongoing series of the history of hats in the 20th century. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.